Hello there friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be doing our last ever tooth morphology video. In the last episode we looked at the permanent molars, both upper and lower, and in this episode we will be tackling the canines. These are the last teeth we need to discuss in the permanent dentition, so I hope you've enjoyed this series, and if you did, please leave a like in this video and subscribe if you're new. The canines are quite different from incisors in that they have no mamelons, long crowns and long roots, and they're also wider buccolingually than the incisors. Now moving on to the upper canines in particular. If we take a labial perspective of the upper canines, we can see that they have a curved surface nearer the cervical margin, so that's where the crown meets the gum or crown meets the root. Then lower down towards the incisal edge they have a much more flattened surface here. And lastly, instead of a flat incisal edge, they have a central cusp, and hence are known as a single cusped tooth. There are further details about the labial surface, which I'll explain in a moment, but first allow me to read out my notes here. So the maxillary canines are actually the longest teeth that you have in your mouth in terms of the incisor-apical distance, so literally the whole length of the tooth, as in right from the incisal edge to the tip of the root. But just strictly speaking about the crown length, upper canines have the third longest crown, mandibular canines have the longest of all, and then upper central incisors, and hence the upper canines are the third longest in terms of crown height. And because the upper canines have the longest root in the mouth, that actually makes them the most stable. Now for determining between left and right, for the upper maxillary teeth, please note I'm stressing upper here, we can look at the direction that the root tip bends. I wouldn't always trust this, but in 99% of cases the tip of the roots point distally, as for many of the teeth. And then also for many of the teeth, the distal cusp slope is slightly longer than the mesial cusp slope. If you remember from my premolars video, this is actually the opposite to the maxillary first premolar, in that the mesial cusp slope is actually longer than the distal in that particular case, in the first upper premolar. However, in all of the other cases, bar one in the deciduous dentition, the distal cusp slope is longer than the mesial cusp slope. I hope I made that clear. So to summarise, for the upper first permanent canine, the distal cusp slope is longer than the mesial. The one other exception to the rule is the deciduous maxillary canines. We can see a huge swelling on the distal side and just the tiniest hint of developmental lobes on the labial surface of the canines. Now if we take a palatal view of this tooth, we can see a distinctive cingulum which has a palatal ridge that runs down from the cingulum to the cusp tip, and then we have two marginal ridges at the sides which create a little space, a little indent either side of that palatal ridge, which are the two fossae, the mesial fossa and the distal fossa. So if you appreciate this diagram, you can kind of understand why we were taught in tooth waxing to build down to the incisal tip and then build the sides. So that way it's a lot easier to recreate a model version of the permanent canines. And may I just add that all canines have this basic outline, basic sort of palatal view. Then the last thing I have written down here is that if you get asked what tooth has the most well-developed cingulum, the answer would be the maxillary canines. So they have the most well-developed cingulum, more so than the central incisors. Alright, moving on to a proximal view, we can see that the incisal cusp tip, which is quite sharp in the maxillary canines, sits more labially or facially, as hopefully you can see in this diagram. And you can use that information to help you identify between the upper and lower canines, because in the lowers you'll notice that when we get to it that the incisal cusp tip actually isn't quite as sharp and also sits a little bit more lingually. This isn't the best incisal view diagram. Hopefully this gives you a rough idea of what's going on. I think I'll show you some better pictures when I'm editing this video. But essentially you can see where the marginal ridges are, the palatal ridge, and you can see the two fossae. If I redrew that diagram, you should actually see that the cusp tip is slightly more facial. And that's the upper canines done, so now we can move on to the lowers. The characteristics of the lowers are quite similar to the uppers. So the lower canines have the longest crown out of all of the teeth, just a smidge taller than the upper central. They have the second longest roots, the first longest being the maxillary canine, permanent. And these often have a bifurcated root. Right, I've put exclamation mark, beware of the trap. So for the mandibular canines, the root tip tends to bend mesially rather than distally on this particular tooth. As far as I know, this is not true for any other teeth, so do watch out for that. Don't just look at the roots. So differences between uppers and lowers. The cusp tip on lowers are not quite as sharp, I've already mentioned that. The cingulum is less well developed. It's way more well developed than the lower incisors are in comparison to their upper incisors. And also the cingulum has a slight mesial inclination, so that's something you could look out for on the lower canines. I've also already mentioned this, but when you look at the tooth proximally, you can see that the cusp tip is slightly more lingual and the crown is pushed back slightly. This is true for many of the mandibular teeth because of the fact that the upper teeth tend to push the lower teeth towards the tongue. And lastly, if we take an incisal view of the lower canines, we can see it's a bit more 90 degrees towards the mesial surface, whereas on the distal surface it's significantly more curved. So I've hugely over-exaggerated it in this diagram, but I'm really trying to stress that the distal surface, where it meets the labial, it curves and it's more continuous, whereas the mesial surface from the cusp tip, where that joins, goes down mesially and onto the labial surface, it's more 90 degrees. You have a much more sharper turn there. And that is all I have to say about the permanent canines, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this series. I think it's unlikely that I'll make another tooth morphology video before the test on Wednesday. However, if you really want me to do a deciduous video before, say, the summatives in June, I think that's when we have our proper end of year exams, then please let me know and I'm more than happy to do it. But I really need to hear back from you guys what you think of these videos and let me know how you think this is going, because I'm really enjoying this but I don't know if my audience is. So anyway, this was fun. Tune in next time, whenever the next time is. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video or at uni, hopefully. Goodbye.